Alright, for today's critical thought, we're going to be discussing the action genre, and more specifically, some of the high-level talks you can have about action game design. Now, the action genre has been one of my bread and butter plays for a very long time, be it titles like God Hand and Devil May Cry, to even some recent changes like with the Soulsborne series. But what makes the action genre so interesting to discuss is that it is predominantly based on player skill rather than RPG abstraction. While the many games do feature RPG leveling up and equipment upgrades, it still comes back to the player and their ability to learn and grow over the course of playing. And when it comes to action game design, there are a lot of topics we can drill down into. But if you guys want me, if you have anything specific you'd like me to cover in a future video, let me know in the comments below. But for today, there's two big parts I want to focus on when it comes to high level design. Because these two are areas that a lot of developers tend to struggle with, and yet they're still cornerstones or even foundations of what it means to make a good action game. And the reason for today's video is I recently played through the game Ulaka on on stream, and I got a few questions as to what makes an action game good or bad. Because again, because they are skill or player based, it may be harder for people to kind of read what makes a good or a bad one. I like to use the analog to high performance cars when it comes to action gameplay, because there's a lot that goes on behind the scenes or under the engine that determines whether or not the game works or not. And a lot of that, unless you're actively playing the game or play the genre, it can be hard for someone just watching someone play to figure things out. But when it comes to good action design, at least at the basic level, there's two big areas I want to focus on. They are the player's own utility when it comes to combat, and the enemy designs themselves. Now, when it comes to player utility, I'm referring to what kind of moves or options the player has when it comes to combat. And this is very important because this determines both offense and defensive capabilities. One of the easiest ways to mess up when it comes to action game design is not really developing the player's abilities. You see this in a lot of action games that focus on only one or two combo strings, and that's it. This is where the majority of the time you're going to be spent pressing square, 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 or triangle, 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 and that's it. That's all you can do, and that's what you're going to be repeating for how many hours it takes you to play. Some of my favorite examples of the action genre when it comes to combat are about giving the player a variety of means of attacking enemies. For instance, in Devil May Cry 3, every weapon in the game has its own unique combo string. Or something like God Hand, where you literally, you literally build your combos based on what moves you attach to Gene. And I would love to play God Hand on stream at some point. If it's ever available on PS4 or PlayStation, PlayStation Now? But regardless, it's important to give the player a variety of options, and more importantly, make sure the player has what they need to fight these enemies. For instance, one of the big issues I have with the Yakuza series, and I think I'm about to cough again, so keep that in mind, is that they design it in a way that if the player repeats the same moves or strategies, the enemy will auto-block or auto-dodge in order to punish the player. So the idea is you're supposed to keep mixing up your attacks or whatever your options are. But, the problem is you don't have too many options when you're starting out in Yakuza game, and in the latest one, which I can't talk too much about, does limit you as well. So the problem is you're going to run into these cases where you can't really land a hit on the enemy because you don't have any more moves or different combos to try, because the enemy has basically read all of them. And this takes things further with Yakuza because of the fact that you have a predominantly one button combo system. You're using square for your basic attacks, and then triangle is the finisher. The problem, of course, is because everything is built off of the square combo, it means that it's very easy for them to start recognizing that and begin their auto counter. For an example of a game that I think that does it right is one of my favorite hidden gems, Kia Dark Lineage for the PS2. That was an amazing game that was essentially Jack and Daxter meets an action game. So you have all the platforming and crazy adventures, but you also have beat 'em up, or actually this will be more action-based design. And in Kia, you have a 2-button combat system, and you also have additional options such as being able to vault over enemies, and then you can grab them. It just felt really right in your hands to play that game. But more importantly, even though the enemies also would auto block and auto dodge, you had enough moves or enough moves in your utility that you can easily switch off to something else. And it's very important to keep that up. Now, when it comes to the defensive side, defense is its own can of worms when it comes to action gameplay. You have to give the player some means to avoid or mitigate damage. And this is a major part of whatever the philosophy of your game is going to be. For instance, in God of War, the block is a very important part of that. But in something like Soulsborne, dodging is key. And the game basically punishes you for standing still and getting hit by stamina loss or just running out and then getting whacked by the enemy. But any action game worth its salt needs to have defensive options. Without them, you're basically stuck, especially when multiple enemies attack you, or if the enemy is doing something special that it's not easy to just like move out of the way for. But again, that's a topic that could be in of itself its own video. Now, another major part about combat, at least from the player side before we move on, is the overriding philosophy of most action games will either fall on one-on-one fights or group battles. And it's very important that whatever you decide is your philosophy, the player's moveset and utility must be balanced accordingly. One of the issues I see with a lot of action games for first times is that they'll design the game either around one of those two philosophies, but then introduce combat or encounters that are built on the opposite. So, if my attacks are only meant to hit one enemy, I'm going to be fighting nothing but group battles. Or, if I'm meant to fight multiple enemies that, with very wide attacks that have a very long cooldown, you then put me into a fight one-on-one with an enemy who is super fast, or can just easily get around, or in some cases, they may not be able to be stunned or hit into a pattern where they can't be stun locked, is what I mean. But when it comes to action game design, you have to be really careful about this, because this can lead to unintentional frustration. For instance, in God of War, as you know, Kratos' Blades of Chaos are meant to attack in very wide patterns around him, or very straightforward at the end of his combos. But the Ares part, where you have to protect his family, can be ridiculously frustrating because you can't easily target that one enemy who's attacking the family. And when I was playing on the highest difficulty setting, that came really close to making me rage there. But on the other side of things, Soulsborne is a series that is built predominantly on one-on-one fights. And in that series, they actively discourage you from fighting group battles. And this is also why the 2 or 3 enemy boss battles are so much more challenging, because the game's combat and camera are not balanced and designed to fight multiple opponents. Now, in many games, what they may end up doing is having a normal, one-person attack, and then having a separate button for your group swings. But again, you need to be really careful how you balance things. In Yakuza, for instance, the lock-on does a terrible job of differentiating multiple enemies, and while you're really meant to fight one-on-one, the game throws tons of enemies at you, and pretty much forces you down specific patterns and specific ways of fighting. And with that said, going back to what I said regarding utility and how you design the combat system, players are very smart when it comes to this. If they know that one combo is always going to be the best options, they're going to repeat that again and again. And it's why you have to be really careful when you design combos that add bonus damage. Because if I know that this combo does the most damage for the most utility, that's all I'm going to use for every fight for however long the game is. Now, excuse me. Now, we're about 10 minutes in, so I think we have enough time to talk about enemy design. Enemy design in an action game is built on how you want to test the player and how you're going to design your various encounters. When it comes to building the enemies up, I came up with a very simple system of how to categorize them. So the first enemy type are the grunts. These are the most numerous. They're the guys that are designed to introduce you to combat or be annoying when you are being outnumbered or they're teamed up with another group. So you have just about every undead starter enemy in Soulsborne, the first enemy or first ninjas in Ninja Gaiden, and again, pick an action game, the first enemy you fight is a grunt. The second type of enemy are support types. These are the ones that will do something special. Maybe they'll shield enemies, maybe they'll heal, fly, maybe they'll stop you from doing something. There's usually only one or two of these per enemy encounter once they're introduced, and they're designed to basically aid their allies and make your life even harder. The next category, or I like to call them lieutenants. These are the bulkier enemies who are designed to basically force you to slow down and deal with them accordingly. Sometimes they are mini bosses or introduced that way before they're folded into the main fight. In the old beat-em-up genre, the very fat enemies are usually considered lieutenants. Now, with that said, the next class are usually the mini-bosses. These are enemies that are usually one-offs, or they'll have some very specific way of fighting that makes them incredibly challenging. And just like lieutenants, they'll get folded into regular counters as time goes on. And then last but not least are the boss battles, the very unique battles that will of course be very difficult for you to deal with, and in some cases they may actually throw these as normal enemies in the future, or require you to fight them again, maybe in a separate encounter, or the infamous boss rush. Now, good enemy encounter or good enemy design is again looking at how you built your combat system for the player and deciding how you're going to challenge them accordingly. Again, if combat is built on very slow, methodical moves, you gotta be really careful designing enemies to be super fast and super dodgy. Because you can have cases where I'm like swinging the sword very slowly and the enemy's just dancing around me. It's also very important to decide whether or not you or the enemy can interrupt each other, because that will make combat very different. And you can see this in a lot of games that will have some enemies that you can counter or interrupt, and then you have enemies who are uninterruptible, and how much it changes the dynamic. But when it comes to this, another major point is you have to be careful when you introduce rule-breaking enemies. These are enemies that are designed to counter a very specific option that the player has. For instance, in a game, let's say like something like Darkest Dungeon, if you have the ability to stun enemies, a rule breaker would be someone who is immune to stun. If you're playing a game like XCOM, an enemy who can basically override Overwatch or not trigger yours, that would be a rule break. One of the more popular examples of rule breaking in action games came from Bayonetta. In Bayonetta, again, like with a lot of the modern action games, it's built on a dodge as your primary defensive option. But you also have the ability to go into Witch Time that slows things down and is a reward for perfect dodging. In the first game, they introduced gold-plated enemies who were immune to Witch Time. Not only that, but they were also super speedy as well, and I don't think you could interrupt them. So you had this case of an enemy who basically breaks your entire defensive system, and there's no other defensive option or means to get around it. And you have to be really careful like that, because it can make combat become very one-note. Going back to the Yakuza series, one of the more popular things they do is, once a boss is about half to a quarter dead, they'll gain permanent heat mode. And during this phase, they will not be interruptible. You cannot interrupt their combos. So if you try and attack them and they begin their attack, they're just going to immediately lay into you. Or, if you're attacking them and they do an auto dodge around, they can start their combo and there's nothing you can do about it. And again, this all comes back to balance and design. But with that said, we're going to wrap up today's Critical Thought here because we're about 15 minutes in and there's a lot more we can go over. But thank you so much for watching. If you'd like to suggest a topic for a future video, again, whether it's action design related or not, let me know in the comments below. But otherwise, check back for daily discussions on design here and on Game Wisdom, where we examine the art and science of games. Before we get to the credits, just wanted to give a quick thank you and shout out to the supporters over on patreon.com/GWBycer. Thank you so much for watching this video. If you enjoyed it, be sure to like and subscribe to the channel. Check back around 10 Eastern for regular streaming. If you'd like to suggest games for me to cover or topics to talk about, let me know in the comments below. For a collection of my writings as well as weekly podcasts on design, check out game-wisdom.com. To support the Game Wisdom Patreon, you can find us on there on patreon.com/GWBycer. $1 will get you into our private Discord channel where we talk game topics and more. $5 will get you voting privileges for any major event, including the Saturday Night Grab Bag, Patreon-funded goals, and more. Thanks again for watching, and I hope you enjoy more videos here on the Game Wisdom YouTube channel.